Okay, so this is a final project that I did for leadership in organizations. I just did the infographic for the actually the assignment submission, but I'm experimenting with a PowerPoint technique. I don't know that Zoom is going to be able to capture it, but it's a morph uh, between segments of the modules essentially. So the modules that I'm referring to there, I went through my notes and I highlighted about 18 different takeaways that that were things I wanted to integrate into my character or my leadership repertoire moving forward. Um, so yeah, the first of those items was keeping a journal. So this was we watched a number of TED Talks in the course, and I really remember this one. This was Teresa Amibel's "Track Your Small Wins." I'm not sure if I'm saying her last name correctly, but yeah. So she was a Harvard professor, and her message resonated with me because psychologist Jordan Peterson, also a former Harvard professor, he has commented before that there's no difference between writing and thinking. Accordingly, he's asserted that not speaking or writing is akin to not being. And the reason for that is that we've basically outsourced the evolutionary process to the prefrontal cortex, so we can think through our actions before we embody them, right? Because the prefrontal cortex has grown out of the motor cortex. So yeah, one of Teresa's statements in the report was about a former student that she had who testified to the utility of journaling, and she said that she found herself keeping the diary because she was so busy and not despite her commitments. And that was really a paradigm shift, but it struck me as correct because I've noticed that with my exercise. The more obligations to perform that I have, the more important exercise becomes. And so, yeah, in terms of I could say academic or job or just performance as such. Yeah, and so Teresa's second discovery, the progress principle, which was something we were tested over in the course, also resonated with Peterson's statement of the neurophysiology that most of our positive emotion comes from perceiving ourselves move towards a valued goal. And Teresa's first discovery, which was the inner work life effect, pretty similar, resonated with, I don't know how to say it, it's Csikszentmihalyi's, I guess, the flow state. And it's basically where you lose a sense of time and you think, well, that flew by, which is kind of consistent with the what is it, like an aphorism that time flies when you're having fun. It's not exactly fun, it's more like meaningful engagement. And anyway, this flow state, the inner work life effect, it maps onto Peterson's discussion of balancing yin and yang and Taoist symbolism, which maps onto the left and right brain hemispheres, which are roughly adapted for operating in domains that you have mastered and new territory, or order and chaos. And we know this, for example, because when we dream, we're moving information across the corpus callosum from the right hemisphere into the left hemisphere. So it's like we condense and we archive it by so doing. So anyway, the next steps that she emphasized as one of the utilities of journaling, identifying next steps, putting them down on paper, that really struck me after listening to Dave Ramsey, Christian financial coach Dave Ramsey. He talked about how in the early 1990s, he wrote down in his journal that he wanted to develop a personal financing coaching system, right? And so now his radio show has over 18 million listeners worldwide. And so, yeah, he said, obviously there's tremendous power in writing down ambitions. So yeah, the talk, it inspired me to recommit to regular journaling, to say the least. So the next thing I found particularly useful was Ginger Mihailik's leadership advice. Ginger was one of several guest speakers, associated with Hopkins, presumably that we heard from throughout the course, answer questions about leadership and speak from their experience, which was really cool. You don't want all theory from people with no experience, but she talked about articulating organizational vision clearly and extending trust to people that she had hired on the basis of their confidence. So number one, the vision and clarity, it reinforces the power of the word, and it also ties into SMART goals, which was something we were tested over. So S is specific in the acronym. Point two is speaks to the value of meritocratic hiring practices, which are diametrically opposed, by the way, to diversity of identity group, which is what everyone wants to focus on now. And the courage as being a superior place to reach, and its distinction from naivety, that was something Peterson explained, is that if you're aware that the other person has the potential to harm you and you extend trust to them anyway, that's courage. And that is distinct from naivety, which is when you don't recognize that they can hurt you, and more perniciously, you don't realize your own capacity to hurt others and to hurt yourself. All right, so the next item was an exercise that we engaged in during a synchronous session. We had a number of sync sessions throughout the course, and these were pretty cool because they transformed the experience into more of a dialogue than a traditional lecture, although there's room for that too, for sure. In this one, the question we were posed, going into the breakout rooms, was the challenge of identifying what we perceive to be the most challenging issues in leadership. And so I think we had like 30 seconds, but my response was integrity, conflict resolution, and the appropriate boundaries of the relationship between the leader and his subordinates, essentially. So integrity, this is true at multiple levels of analysis. I think we all know this. The Bible verse that I like is, "He that ruleth his spirit is mightier than he that taketh a city." And so that's integrity, right? Because we have impulses that we have to fight, and that's ruling your spirit, is that something should be sovereign internally, even. So, and my favorite quote of my favorite definition of integrity is, it's when your public life matches your private life. Okay, so the second was conflict resolution, and I noticed in the course that I have a number of classmates who struggle with basically being passive aggressive, which is the classic pitfall of someone who's high in trait agreeableness, and that's the second most common reason for coming to psychotherapy, which is assertiveness training, essentially. Yeah, it's a challenge of knowing when to have conflict, right? And the recognition that conflict is inevitable. It's usually the case where it's like, okay, we can deal with this now, or this can amplify and perpetuate and grow into a much more serious problem. Okay, so lastly, there was the relationship parameterization and the dynamic, and this was something that stuck with me from listening to a military leader who said that he characterized trying to be friends with your subordinates as JV leadership. And that really stuck with me. It made me think about, the appropriate boundaries. But the guy, he opined that he said that whenever you get into like a battle, a high stakes situation, if your subordinates perceive you as their peer, they will not follow you, right? Obviously, because what do you know? You're their peer, right? So you need to be an exemplar, and that is, a leader like a star is a target for emulation. You have to be an example, and to be an ideal, you must be above them. And that's not to say that you're lording your position over them or your position is undeserved. This isn't tyranny. The key distinction is that you have to be above them by their evaluation. That's it, really. All right, so the next item that I thought was worthwhile was a personality assessment. During the residency, I pointed out to one of the groups that the Myers-Briggs is, as Peterson has described it, it's a relic of the 1930s. It was useful then, but ever since 1960, we've had more rigorous statistical devices available, which facilitated the emergence of the Big Five. As an aside, I actually criticized the Myers-Briggs accordingly during the residency, because we were supposed to provide feedback to the groups, and one of the groups was going to be relying on this and the implicit association test, which is complete garbage by psychometric standards. And who is it? Masram Banerjee, or one of the authors, someone at Harvard, has acknowledged that it's not statistically sound, but nevertheless, people are just taking it, running with it. HR departments everywhere. But so when I criticized this, the teacher's aide told me to withhold judgment. And she made the absurd claim that everything utilized by human resource departments is good. No. Everything that comes out of human resource departments is not good, right? Suspending judgment is inconsistent with the advice in this course to maximize task-related conflict while minimizing emotional conflict. That's the caveat. But yeah, if we don't evaluate ideas critically, we are vulnerable to groupthink, which I'll discuss in a moment. So yeah, the Myers-Briggs, it persists basically because it's quick and easy, and people don't like percentile rank readouts. They don't understand the difference between a percentage and a percentile. But ultimately, the Myers-Briggs sacrifices accuracy and reliability for those flattering conveniences. So anyway, my Myers-Briggs result, ISTJ, is consistent with my Big Five readout. Although the ISTJ is a much lower resolution picture of my personality, assessing your personality is certainly useful because it informs what socioeconomic niche you can meaningfully occupy, right? That otherwise we wouldn't have the Big Five dimensions if there wasn't niches in the environment for them to occupy and for those people to reproduce. Thinking in evolutionary terms, in an evolutionary paradigm. So anyway, I'd recommend understandmyself.com. It's been really useful to me and my fiance. Next was Professor Milter's explanation and demonstration of the multi-attribute utility model. This was something that he showed us how to use in Excel. And, he stated that it's intended to facilitate someone to make tough choices while remaining consistent with their values. And that reminded me of Dave Ramsey speaking about personal finance, because he emphasized that personal is the operative word, and therefore we need to include things like sentimental value when we're making decisions like selling a house, for example, which often have sentiment attached to them. So this framework definitely facilitates a way to holistically evaluate choices that vary along a number of dimensions. So it allows you to assign weights and quantify those things. It uses a sum product calculation ultimately. In fact, anyway, this is definitely one of my biggest takeaways. I've already utilized this framework at least twice in my negotiation course, also taught by Professor Milter this semester. And I'm certain I'm going to use it to navigate the purchase of my next car, house, job, everything. So, but granted, I have an affinity for Excel to begin with. In the M4 Module 4 overview video on influence, Professor Milter posited that the strongest way to influence people is to genuinely and deeply listen to others. And then he prompted us to think of people that we respect, and he asserted that most likely they were especially good listeners. And yeah, as soon as I thought about it, he's absolutely correct. The next item was taken from the reading titled Group Work. This is by Irving Janis. And, I kind of alluded to this earlier with regard to, criticizing the Myers-Briggs, but, when I was going over the reading for this, I wrote in my notes that the symptoms of groupthink arise when the members of decision-making groups become motivated to avoid being too harsh in their judgments of their leaders or their colleagues' ideas. So, more ominously, there's an assertion that followed that in the text stating that paradoxically, soft-headed groups are often hard-hearted when it comes to dealing with out-groups or enemies. They find it relatively easy to resort to dehumanizing solutions. And this is super true. There's a very primordial tendency to resort to us versus them thinking, right? This reminded me of Peterson's example of it's the mother bear mauls you to death out of compassion for her cubs, right? Compassion is not an untrammeled virtue. Accordingly, excess compassion puts people in a paradigm where they reflexively categorize any dissenting opinions or criticism as akin to being a reptile that's preying on their infants, basically. I suspect that atrazine, which is it's a pesticide that I learned about in my ecology course, and elevated progesterone in birth control, the prevalence of birth control, may be contributing to this kind of behavior. Okay, next was a video that we watched about the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was super worthwhile. I made a note, there was an assertion early on that team members should reflect diversity of opinion, which is so relevant to our current cultural climate, because we've lost that. Currently, the current assumption is basically that people have to embody their diversity. Like that's the only kind of diversity that matters. It's basically it's based on a set of identity groups, race, sexuality, etc. And that's not the kind of diversity that actually matters, and thankfully so, as this demonstrated. Nevertheless, admissions committees, they've exalted diversity, but it doesn't actually mean diversity of opinion. There's a terribly pernicious kind of strategic equivocation that they're doing when they're co-opting words. Anyway, the reason why the group that JFK assembled for navigating the Cuban Missile Crisis was the reason why it worked so well was the forum and the ground rules that he established, but it was because these people were all at the top of various domains, and so they had different perspectives and experiences that had been vetted by the fact that they had been elected to the high socioeconomic positions they occupied. And so this actually connects, I just recognized this connects to another point that I'm going to get to soon about the Lion King and the Disney movie. There's a message in there about paying attention to all facets of the kingdom, right? It has to do with Egyptian symbolism, and anyway, I'll get to that. But JFK, he accomplished that, probably unknowingly, but that's what he did, and that That's why we're all still here, perhaps. You know, it was a incredibly pivotal moment in our history. Anyway, accordingly, you know, Hopkins, I would say, could benefit from rethinking what's behind their current worship of diversity and just exactly what kind of diversity is meant by those pushing it. Okay, so this next item was a fun little exercise we did in a breakout room during a synchronous session. And so what we had to do was we had to rank order 15 items in terms of their priority, in terms of their utility to us getting back to a space station. Like, we're floating in space and we have to get back to a space station, and there's a number of things that we have to rank order in terms of priority. So it's like there's like flares, or there's like an oxygen tank, there's a gun, there's, you know, food, there's water, there's anyway. So the takeaway after we did this exercise, I wrote down in my note that teams that reached a consensus performed better than the average of their individual performances. So this is really key. What it means is that leaders come to a superior team consensus via structured dialogue, right? There's that logos again. That's the redemptive element in the Western tradition. This was particularly important because up to this point, I basically thought that teams were completely useless before this exercise, at least of the mandated variety that's commonplace in academia. You know, they facilitate freeloading and loafing, and there's a tragedy of the commons effect. And I've given presentations on the topic, but this was an important thing for me to recognize the potential value in groups. And so I had to reconcile these two positions. And the way that I did that, I noticed that the key element of this exercise was that the individual performances had to be done first. We each individually rank ordered these items before we got into our groups, right? And then we hashed it out, and we figured out we came to a group consensus. And then the group consensus was superior to the average of our individual ranks. And it was, we did some math that calculated the deviation from the correct answer, the correct answers, which were given afterwards. Anyway, so in order for group work in academia to benefit from this principle, what would actually have to be done is that, you know, by my abstraction of the lessons from this, and the extrapolation, everyone would have to submit their individual work first and then hybridize that through dialogue, right? Critical dialogue. And that's never the case. I've never had that. We've never had something like that. And I think the reason why is because group work in academia cuts the grading down to 1/5 or 1/4 of what it would otherwise be, right? You know, and you know, I'm open to having a discussion about that, but that's what it looks like to me. All right, so next was excuse me, Mark First. He was a excuse me, he was a head of a volunteer of a nonprofit organization. I think it was like United Way, perhaps. And he was one of the speakers that we heard from repeatedly throughout the course. He was asked what was the most important thing to remember when crafting a message, and in response to that, he said, you know, it's more often about him letting his subordinates propose a solution, propose their own plan, evaluating that plan, and then if it's viable, letting them follow their plan instead of a top-down imposition of Mark's plan. And anyway, that resonated with some leadership advice I had gleaned from a military leader. So the lesson ultimately is, if it's their plan, they're going to invariably be more enthusiastic about executing it because they've got skin in the game, right? And so there's another profound benefit to this is it hedges against the kind of sabotage that is all too often a consequence of imposing a plan that people have that your subordinates strongly oppose, right? They're motivated to see it fail because then it's like, well, I told you so, that kind of thing. So next was a reading. It was harnessing the science of persuasion. And there was a statement that I wrote down I want to read here. There's strong empirical evidence to show that a choice made actively, that is one that's spoken out loud or written down or otherwise made explicit, is considerably more likely to direct someone's future conduct than the same choice left unspoken. This connected to something I learned in undergrad, that attitudes are more likely to change to match our behavior than we are to change our behavior to match our attitude, right? And those are both solutions to cognitive dissonance, but that's how the research indicates. So anyway, our actions carry more weight than we imagine. That's really what this means. And the quote from the reading also reinforced the danger in compelled speech. Dr. Peterson has asserted there's nothing more sacred in the Western tradition than the word. So the problem, for example, by being mandated to call somebody by their preferred pronouns, whatever they make up, there's like over 70 of them now. That sounds innocuous at first glance, but the trouble is that if you verbalize something that you know to be a lie, you risk not being able to distinguish the truth anymore. So then you've corrupted your moral navigational system, basically, which is it's a superordinate moral problem. Next I was impressed with Rhonda Miller's warning. So I think Rhonda she was probably a MD, MBA. She was, I believe, a hospital administrator for Johns Hopkins. She was someone that gave us advice throughout the course on leadership. And she warned that if you only populate your committees with cheerleaders, then you'll never know the truth. And this was in response to a prompt, who do leaders look to for advice? I thought this was wise, and it was consistent with one of Peterson's warnings about fame and power. He talked about Joseph Stalin being in this position where they're surrounded by sycophants, basically, and those are people that only sing your praises. And it's a good way to go insane, because it deprives you of the kind of critical feedback that we all need, we depend upon to calibrate when we're being appropriate or inappropriate, right? And so you see this thing playing out a lot on social media. Actresses, for example, have a bunch of fans because of their performance in movies, and then suddenly start opining on politics, and people only sing their praises because there's a halo effect, but it's not useful. The actors and actresses can really lose their tether that way. Okay, next was how leaders create and use networks. This was Herminia Ibarra and Mark Hunter, some of the course content. There was a sentence that really struck me. It was, many managers do not easily understand that exchanges and interactions with a diverse array of current and potential stakeholders are not distractions from their real work, but are actually at the heart of their new leadership roles. Okay, so this is what I was, what would be the word, foreshadowing when I was talking about JFK's meeting with navigating the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? So again, diverse array of current potential stakeholders. So what I connected this to was one of the most profound lessons that I've ever been exposed to and grasped. And that was Peterson's Jungian, Carl Jung, analysis of Disney's The Lion King, which contains a lot of symbolism implicitly and deliberately. he pointed out that the bird Zazu in the movie is an embodiment of the Egyptian deity Horus, and that they both symbolize the Egyptian reverence for attention. And so the bird Zazu is really it's really an extension of Mufasa, who's the benevolent sovereign in the film. So what it suggests is that the benevolent sovereign, that is leader by election, necessarily pays attention, and that's what keeps the state, the business, etc., properly oriented and productive. And so going deeper, the benevolent sovereign preserves his relationship with the bird, flies over the kingdom. In contrast, when his tyrannical brother takes over the kingdom, he locks up the bird, which reflects the fact that tyrants don't pay attention. They already know everything, right? That's what makes them a totalitarian. In consequence, the kingdom dries up. You can think North Korea, GDP plummets. So yeah, in the film, Pride Rock represents a hierarchy. And elsewhere, Peterson has talked about imagining the world as an infinite landscape of hierarchies, of pyramids. And people are trying to climb to the top of each hierarchy. But to fly above all of the pyramids is to be a leader of leaders, which mythologically converges on hero symbolism and messianic figures. So it's something like cross-domain competence. During the first day of our residency, after the first breakout room, Professor Milter stated that we live in worlds that our conversations create. That's the intimation at the beginning of the Gospel of John in the New Testament. And it speaks to the fact that the world we experience it, definitely the phenomenological world, arises as a consequence of our speech. And that's why freedom of speech is properly construed as sacred in the West. And this was something I emphasized in my leadership development program as well, when I advised to a leader to be prepared, not contrived, because no one will listen to you if you're giving them word salad. So next was more advice from Ginger Mihalich. This was about clarity. I've heard Dave Ramsey similarly describe the need for vision to be granular, right? So high resolution. And then Mihalich indicated that your team needs to collectively visualize the finish line. So what I did was I thought about that visualization of the finish line in terms of Peterson's analysis of Dan Simon's work, Invisible Gorilla Experiment, and other work that Professor Milter also introduced to us. So what it means is that we perceive the world as tools or obstacles relative to our goals. And so that's the power in visualizing the finish line, is that it imbues everything in our experiential world as in terms of its utility or impedance to that goal. Next item was, there was a really valuable takeaway for me, was also a TED Talk we watched during residency day one. The speaker said he learned, this was a military leader, Stanley McChrystal, and he was helping people jump out of military planes. That's the depiction here. He learned that leaders can let you fail and yet not let you be a failure. And that really resonated with a number of us. For me, it reminded me of Peterson's advice to surround yourself with people who have the courage and faith and wisdom to wish you well when you've done something good, and to stop you when you're doing something constructive. And if your friends aren't like that, then they're not your friends. And so this kind of coincides with Redonda's advice about warning about cheerleaders as well. But this idea of leaders being on the side of you, that they're trying to help guide the manifestation of your positive potential, which is what the flower here, the mandala, symbolizes. So finally, I remembered Mark Verdicia's, I hope I'm saying that right, his advice to leverage your technical knowledge in a way that allows you to work as a translator across domains. When he shared this during the last day of the residency, Professor Milter noticed that, it earned a lot of nods from the audience. It really clicked. And so, I paid attention to that. And I noticed that it was also consistent with Redonda Miller's statements from a Module 6 interview. She's a hospital administrator, but she said she still sees patients and, presumably as a physician. And so she said that helps her make administrative decisions that are more in touch with her frontline staff. And so that was definitely something, that I wanted to integrate moving forward. I have a medical background myself, and, together with my MBA competencies that I'm trying to earn, I'm hoping that will allow me to occupy a niche that makes me more valuable than if I had either competency alone. Okay, well, that was 17 different things. I couldn't fit the 18th item on here, and I definitely thought 2 pages was more than sufficient. So thanks for watching.